Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on building the future of mobility. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Kate Shubik, and I'm part of the New Lab team. And while many of you might be familiar with our work at New Lab, for those of you who aren't, New Lab is a community of experts and innovators applying transformative technology to solve the world's biggest challenges. Through both our membership and our studios, we bring together entrepreneurs, engineers, inventors, and industry leaders to create sustainable solutions and enterprises. And we employ technologies, including robotics, AI, and material science to transform what matters most, things like our health, the environment, and infrastructure. Today's discussion will focus on how emerging technology, advanced research, and innovative initiatives are shaping the future of mobility, with Michigan emerging as a leader in this space. You will hear from industry, academic, and innovation experts as they discuss how they are leveraging technology, partnerships, and real-world testbeds to accelerate advancements in mobility. Shana Horowitz, Vice President of Products and Programs at New Lab, will moderate the discussion with a great group of panelists, including Roshni Shokar, Startup and Entrepreneur Engagement at Michigan Central, Hui Peng, Director of M-City at the University of Michigan, Allison Malik, CEO and founder of Middle Third, Maggie Shannon, Michigan Associate Director at Cavnew, and Regaria Goddard, Global Innovation Manager at General Motors. So just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be taking some questions from the audience throughout this discussion. So if you'd like to ask a question, please just type it out in the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, and I will be helping to get those out in front of our panelists throughout the talk. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Shana to kick us off.
Great. Thank you. It's fantastic to be here with all of you. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedules, especially as we head into this final stretch of the year, to join me in this discussion today. So the first kind of big headline, big topic I want to dive into is thinking about transportation networks that work for everyone. So I'm going to start with a kind of general question, but maybe I'll pass it to Hui to give us his 2 cents first. So my question, let's start with this statement. Today, there are many ways to get from point A to point B. So we've got personal vehicles, new types of micro-mobility options. We've got ride sharing. We've got public transit systems, buses and trains. And increasingly, electrification, autonomy, and connectivity are showing up in these different modes of transit. So from your perspective and the work that you're doing at M-City and more broadly, the great research that's happening at University of Michigan, what innovations or options are emerging for people or goods to get from point A to point B? And what are you most excited about in terms of what you're seeing? Oops, you're on mute.
Of course, I was. Okay, so of course there are a lot of technologies that multimodal, shared are the new thing. Electrification is the new thing. M-City, we are not focusing on the share per se, but we are focusing on technologies that are in general supporting many of the same purposes, make traveling safer, cleaner, cheaper, or more sustainable, and more equitable. There are several technologies that we have been working with many of our M-City company members over the last several years that I think are fundamentally will impact a lot of what we just say, safer, cheaper, and so forth. The number one, I will just summarize it as a yellow hat technology. Now, yellow hat is the part of the uniform by the Japanese elementary school kids. The yellow hats really make them very identifiable, easy to see, and make them much safer. So in general, these technologies are not the technology you put on a AV per se, but they are technologies that make other road users much easier to detect and even communicate with you. Technologies including connectivity, even new innovative coating material that make detecting other cars or vulnerable road users easier, or even edge computing based on a roadside sensor, helping to broadcast the presence of vulnerable road user. So in general, there are a lot of potentials for this so-called yellow hat technologies to help the AV technology, camera, radar, LiDAR, perception, planning, control to be much easier, again, safer, cheaper, equitable. The second technology group I would summarizing would be simulation testing and augmented reality. We all know that the road testing is very expensive, time-consuming. Simulations are now available. So MCT test facility is now modeled in 8 commercial software and 2 open source software. So companies not only using the real testing at MCT, but also using simulations. We also develop augmented reality technologies that for certain purposes, for example, congestion or fuel consumption purposes, a company can come to MCT and while with only one or a couple of automated vehicles, they can simulate and interact with dozens or hundreds of augmented reality vehicles. So technologies involving integration of simulation, testing, augmented reality is also very important. The third technology group I would focus on is the RTK and automated labeling. We know that there are a lot of talks about HD maps. Some companies believe them, some companies don't. RTK in the past was very expensive. The first RTK we purchased at MCT is $100,000 unit from Oxford Technology, but now we just manufactured 10 RTK devices at MCT with very comparable accuracy, and it's $400 each. We plan to use this widely available RTK technologies to do many creative things, such as automated labeling. We are envisioning a future when we can collect data. All the vehicles, all the vulnerable road users is wearing a RTK device, and we can do automated labeling. And this will be a much better labeling technology because in the past, human labeling camera images are very inaccurate and very expensive. So going forward, these are the 3 technology groups that we are very excited to develop at MCT.
Great. I love that. I love especially that first category. I haven't heard that name before, but I think it's fantastic to see that there's been so much focus on all of the technology that needs to go into the vehicle itself to make it autonomous, but starting to really think about what is the environment or ecosystem of technologies that are going to need to be present in those environments where a vehicle is operating in that way. And love to hear, certain technologies going down in price, becoming more widely available. What does that mean as we get these new modes to scale? So that's a great way to start the conversation. Thanks, Wei. Allison, I want to turn to you next. Today you're at middle third, but you're also a startup founder, maybe in your past life, and an engineer as well. So I think you bring a very well-rounded perspective to this conversation. And one, I could bring you back to that time when you were at May Mobility, and in your work there, it was really, focused on how not just could you bring this technology to market, but how could you actually partner with both private and public entities so that your technology was a success when it arrived in a new community. So can you talk about the importance of kind of partnerships and being able to identify not only your customers, but your advocates when you're designing a new mobility solution that needs to fit within an existing community or an existing place?
Yeah, so we had a lot of fun getting to identify early communities that were very excited about being able to bring autonomous technology, and really worked hard to find communities that also understood the mobility challenges that they were facing. And we chose to take that path because we thought it would help create more durable and sustainable change in how communities get around. So that was a really strong focus for us from the get-go. And when we would work with these partners and enter into communities, especially when you want to bring a new technology, sometimes that can feel scary, especially for people that don't get to go visit MCity or aren't reading up on the latest and greatest in publications like TechCrunch. They'll see a car driving itself around and be like, what is that? I'm not getting into it. Why is it here? And so it becomes really critical for working with partners, working with trusted entities in the community first, as an entrepreneur, to build trust between you and those leaders, and then to work with those leaders to be able to help for outreach into the community, so people can start to learn, start to understand why you're there, what service you can provide, what benefits you provide. And that also becomes really important, is the ability to talk about how are you helping the community, and making sure that that's mapped with ways that the community is actually asking for help, to, again, help with that successful, sustainable operation and the ability to grow your company on solid ground. And so from that perspective, the partnerships were very critical, and us, first getting out to market, but then also making sure that we had a good link back to our customer voices.
Nice. That's great. Gary, I want to turn to you next. In your time at GM, at one point you were on the Maven Mobility Services team, a ride sharing and long-term rental service that was active in 17 cities. So I want to get your perspective. Can you share more about the white space that GM saw in the market when it first launched Maven, and key learnings for new players in the space, new mobility services that may be coming online, the go-to-market strategy that you had with Maven, and what that was like?
Sure. I think one of the things that GM saw early on, or that we begin to see, is the automotive industry is disrupting itself. And the younger generations are less attached to these larger assets, houses, cars. A lot of them are staying home for longer. They're not purchasing vehicles. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we reach that community? And as we realized, the other thing that's disrupting the auto industry is car sharing, ride sharing. So people don't have to own the vehicle anymore. And so we started to do the research and understand where could we play. We already own the asset, so we have a core competency to play in this space. We just needed the tech piece of it, the app, to manage it. So that's what prompted Maven initially as a car sharing. So people could share cars without the owner, and minimize having the ownership, the cost of owning it. Shortly after, we expanded the opportunity to launch into the gig economy. Like, we wanted to also patronize that part of the community. We noticed that a lot of our younger generations, they stream multiple jobs together to bring in income. And so also, diving over into that area, we offered Maven ride sharing. Maven Gig, actually, it's the gig economy, and you could either own the car and rent it on a weekly basis, or ride sharing, where you would offer Uber, you'd work for Uber or Lyft, and you offer ride sharing services. And so we really dived into that area because we saw that as a market opportunity. And now, as the market is growing, we're seeing something a little different. COVID obviously has a huge impact on ride share and car share. And so we don't know what that will look like on the other side. Like, I think, maybe car ownership will probably be more attractive going forward. But one thing that ride share and car share does offer is the opportunity to defer that cost until you begin a family, because at that time you probably would want a car. So some of our learnings along the way is, I think we expanded really quickly in Maven. That's probably one of the learnings, that maybe you don't expand so fast, because before we were fully up running in all 17 cities, we started the Maven Gig. And so that's really running, they're parallel business, they're similar, but it is two separate businesses, with two separate P&Ls, although we try to merge it together. And then we even expanded even further and started offering where you could peer-to-peer, so where you as an owner could share your car for the gig economy. So doing too much too fast is probably one of the learnings, but one of the bigger learnings is, as we pivot into EV and AV, we have a roadmap or a landscape that we've already started to develop, and we'll build upon that. Most of our fleet was, or not most of it, but a good portion of our fleet was dedicated to EV. And so we began to be able to collect data points as we place those cars in various cities. So one of the things that I'll probably talk about later but the whole range anxiety and having charging infrastructure, like those things are really important. And so we were able to measure that better, because there has been, two rules of thought, two ways of thinking of, is there really such thing as range anxiety, or are people just kind of nervous because they don't know the unknown? And so we infringed upon that, and we realized that it's probably lesser of an issue than people think it is. But I mean, someone that drives a lot of miles, I mean, it definitely is an issue. One of the other things we recognized early on is partners matter. And so with car sharing and ride sharing, we started to partner with apartments. We started to partner with other small businesses, because that helps you, one, expand your business, two, increase your marketing footprint. And so that those type of things were really important. So building bridges and working with other like-minded companies was really important along the way. And then lastly, I say, I think for GM, like, we're still in our core business of building cars, but we realize how much more how we have to be, more risk averse, and take, just launch into those new markets and just take a look and see if there's something else we can offer. Because we we're an old company, and we've been doing this for a long time, so we know how to build cars, but now that the market is changing, how do we continue to remain relevant?
Yep. Yeah, that's definitely par for the course. The big picture, right, in the landscape is like moving from transportation and thinking about vehicles to mobility services. And the example of ride sharing is such a good one. It's, by design, it requires an ecosystem approach, or sort of partnerships first mindset, in a way that's really different, and a paradigm shift for so many companies who are entering that space. Thank you for those kind of lessons from the front lines. Roshni, I want to turn to you now. Michigan Central, first of all, want you to kind of share with the audience just what is Michigan Central and what's the vision, but also want to hone in on Michigan Central's impact area includes several different neighborhoods. And I wanted to have you talk about kind of how your engagement with the local community is helping to inform Michigan Central's kind of vision for mobility innovation and for bringing that to life in the district.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Michigan Central is the new mobility innovation district that Ford is building in Detroit, in one of the historic neighborhoods, Corktown. And so we're envisioning this to be not just a mobility campus for Ford employees, but also to also bring in people from across the industry, researchers, government officials, startups, entrepreneurs, in order to innovate together and solve some of the big mobility challenges that we're facing in the industry. And the community has been, community engagement has been a big pillar of this development. So throughout the process of kind of renovating the Michigan Central train station, which is one of the anchor buildings of the development, we've been engaging the community through a series of community meetings and also listen and learn sessions to get input on areas that are going to impact them, because we know that we're coming into their neighborhood and we want to make this space, especially the public, like open to the community spaces, as relevant and usable for what the community needs. And then in terms of mobility innovation, one of the big goals of this district is to be testing mobility services and running pilots in the district and in the neighborhoods around it. So, and one great example of that is actually we've partnered with New Lab to launch an accessible street studio, and this is completely focused on connecting neighborhoods in Detroit and getting pilots up and running to do that. So, so with New Lab, we've done a lot of community engagement and research to understand how do these residents get around today, what are their needs, and where can we kind of tap in and insert a pilot to help some of those mobility challenges. We've also been engaging a lot of local mobility experts who've maybe launched pilots like this in the past, and rather than trying to redo something, we're trying to learn and see how we could better serve the community through some of these mobility pilots.
Great, I love that, and thanks for the shout out for the studio that we're collaborating on. It's been a great experience these last kind of several months, getting to immerse in the community and really situate ourselves there before we start looking outwards and saying, okay, of all the technology innovations out there in the world, what can we bring to Detroit that's really going to resonate with residents and with the different neighborhoods and the needs that they have, many of which may even be changing in the face of COVID. Okay, Maggie, I want to bring you into the conversation. We're going to kind of shift into a slightly different topic, and I think it's the perfect segue for you. So I want to talk about kind of infrastructure needed to support this mobility future that we're talking about. So definitely want to give you a chance to kind of introduce to the audience what CAVNU is and what your vision is, and definitely want you to touch on the connected and autonomous vehicle corridor that you are currently focused on bringing to life in Southeast Michigan. So why don't we start there? Tell us about CAVNU, the vision, and really what this first phase of this program is going to look like.
Yeah, great, thanks. So CAVNU, we are a recently launched startup. Our first project being the one you mentioned in Michigan, which is the project I'm the associate director for. But it is our Michigan project is a 40-mile corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor, where we're doing a 2-year feasibility study on what a dedicated CAV, connected and autonomous vehicle corridor would look like. So our hypothesis as a company, and I think that the project being a big piece of this, is that smart infrastructure can accelerate the deployment of CAVs and do so in a way that allows municipalities and local governments to more efficiently and effectively utilize their right of way. So if you think about, one of the primary use cases for this dedicated CAV laneway is public transit. So if you're familiar with bus rapid transit, it's taking a dedicated lane for buses, but those buses might only run every 15 to 20 minutes. What we think we can do with a CAV laneway is take that dead space in between the right of way, the dedicated laneway for the bus, and use that, offer up that dead space to other modes, whether it's shuttles, other forms of shared transit. It could be personally owned vehicles if they have the appropriate connected and autonomous technology, which we see increasing, or freight and delivery vehicles, but utilizing that dead space in a way that's efficient and allows us to really deliver on some of the promises of autonomous vehicles, which we've seen tremendous investment in. It's the safety, it's the efficiency, the sustainability. We also see a lot of these being likely more electrified and connected vehicles as well. So that's the vision. And I think the goal here in Michigan is, and in terms of this specific project, we're doing a 2-year feasibility study in partnership with MDOT. So I think one of the other things that I think about that's interesting as we think about the increasing importance of infrastructure is the fact that it gives the public sector more of a seat at the table in really framing these decisions. The public owns the right of way and they can decide how to use it. So we're partnering directly with MDOT in scoping out this 2-year feasibility study to really just understand what this concept could look like and better understand, and along with partners like Ford and Michigan Central, which is Corktown, which is one of the ends of our corridor. I think it also speaks to the importance of the ecosystem, having End City at the other end of the corridor and a partner for us for testing. So I think it really brings together a lot of the pieces we've discussed as well.
Great. I love that. I love, infrastructure projects are time intensive, capital intensive. And so I love the scale of this project and seeing, a startup take shape around it and be able to bring all those different stakeholders to the table to design and imagine something and then build it in pieces and get those prototypes going and eventually introduce the corridor. So I love it. I love the ambition. Kate, I think we have a question from the audience. You want to chime in with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So question here from the audience on COVID-19. So, I think most notably, this has had quite an impact on public transportation systems. And so this question is around how you see COVID impacting the future of mobility, whether there's lasting changes that we'll see or new modes of transportation that will evolve as a result of this, or things that we'll revert back to after this has passed us. So curious if anyone wants to chime in and kind of share your thoughts as you look ahead and as we come out of COVID-19, what does that look like for mobility and transportation systems?
I'm happy to kick it off. I think with
Thanks,
COVID, we have seen an uptick, especially in the US, of purchase of personally owned vehicles. And so I think for many mobility advocates, that feels like a step back. You see a lot of people not using transit. So in the US right now, there's a lot of conversations about how do we fund this? What do we want the future of that shared transportation to look like? And that those are going to be really big, really tough questions that we will have to grapple with in the US. When we look at the global scale, I think data has shown out that transmission rates and opportunities within transit aren't that bad, but you do still see a significant drop in ridership. But I think in other places, there's a greater dedication, frankly, to transit as an option. You generally have denser cities with more people trying to use limited resources. And so there aren't many other options. Everybody can't go in a car if you're in London or Shanghai. And so as we look at this, it's also opening up a really interesting conversation around active mobility. You see cities giving streets back to cyclists, to pedestrians, to restaurants. And so I do think that there's going to be a lot of really, really tough decisions that are going to have to be made for public transit in the US in particular over the next 12 to 24 months. That said, I think it's also opened up a conversation about how we use our shared infrastructure in a way that I think is exciting and allows us to have a conversation about who are we trying to serve with this infrastructure and what are the goals that we want to achieve, and then aligning how we support different mobility from personally owned passenger vehicles through BRT and cycling and walking. It allows us to really level the playing field instead of just assuming, as is often done in the US, that the personally owned vehicle is going to be the main form of transportation. Mm-hmm. So we are not out of the woods, but it'll be interesting times.
Absolutely. Gary, did you want to add something to that piece?
Yeah, I agree 100% wholeheartedly with everything that Allison said. In fact, we had a few projects in place prior to COVID, or right at the beginning of COVID, that totally have come to a halt. One of the other things I think that is many organizations probably won't go back to a full office schedule. And so that will minimize the traffic on the roads. That will minimize parking needed in like the urban cities or, the downtown areas. Also, I think, those micro mobility opportunities, I think those will be of greater interest. However, in cities like Detroit or New York, where the weather can be incremental, I think there will have to be some really, it had to be a well thought out plan of how do we go forward in that respect. But I do think there are lasting ramifications of COVID. Even with the vaccination, I think people just have been so stigmatized by, just being in close spaces. I think we have a long way to go before we'll be comfortable with, getting in a car with a complete stranger.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. But on a more optimistic note, I like what you point out too. If people's commuting patterns are different and people are truly kind of using the roads differently, it does create kind of new opportunities to rethink, what else, as Allison points out, like what else can the roads be repurposed for? Definitely thinking about, like, I can speak for myself here in Brooklyn in my apartment. I'm thinking about public space and access to green space in a totally different way than I did pre-COVID. So it's, I think, points towards projects like CAVNU's corridor to think about, how we get people safely from point A to point B, but also how the road can sort of serve multiple purposes. Great. So sticking on the point of kind of smart infrastructure for a minute, Hui, is there a certain project you could describe that's taken shape at MCity's testbed in terms of kind of imagining and pointing us towards the future of smart infrastructure? And I did want to know, I saw we had a question earlier from the audience. Maybe you could just take a minute to describe what MCity is. I sort of presumed people knew, but I think it would be helpful for the audience.
Sure, I'll be happy to. So MCT is a public-private partnership. So we focus on pre-competitive research questions. And we think that it's very important that the industry, the government, and the academia work together, because there are plenty of innovations, technologies available from the industry. There are plenty of regulation policy questions that's good for the government or infrastructure development. And then academia must work on the future research questions and provide the talent that's needed to make sure that the CAV or the new mobility industry is viable. If we don't think about everything together, if we don't think about the ecosystem, it wouldn't be successful. CAV is new and it needs the whole village working together to make it successful. Now, in terms of exciting infrastructure projects, of course, we are very glad to be working with CAVNU and with MDOT on this opportunity for making Michigan the place with the first real smart infrastructure that's friendly for CAVs. So that's a very important project for us over the next several years. We are also at MCT, we are working on the concept of MCT.OS. OS, you can say operating system, even though if we have time, then I'll talk about really where does the abbreviation OS come from. But anyway, the idea is that we are transforming MCT into a smart MCT as a model for future smart city. So today, if you come to MCT, many of the elements are automated. Hundreds of street lights, traffic signals, crosswalk, even the access gate, the garage door opens at the touch of a button, and you can control a lot of things. And we can collect sensor input from cameras, radar, LiDARs, and so on and so forth. So overall, we imagine the future of city, especially mega cities. Part of it has to be smart city and make the city more livable and smart, more efficient, and so forth. And the backbone is that the information must flow freely and be used efficiently. So MCT.OS is a model that concept we developed, and we have already licensed our operating system to 3 other organizations. So going forward, again, so when you think about the infrastructure, we work with MDOT and make sure the roads are paved very well, the lane lines are painted very white. But in the meantime, we need to start thinking about the software, the data system behind it.
Great. I love that. Maggie, Kate, I'm superseding you. I'm sorry. I'm seeing something come through the chat, which I think would actually play off nicely of what Wei just said. Maggie, obviously your core focus for the next couple of years is on bringing this CAVNU vision to life in Michigan. But as you think about kind of the bigger opportunity or the groundbreaking nature of this project, what do you hope other cities or regions might learn from Michigan's kind of leadership position in creating this corridor?
I think one important aspect of our project is the partnership we have with MDOT. I think Michigan, as a state, because of the importance of the automotive industry, has such a leadership in these public-private partnerships, because we know for these big infrastructure projects, you really need public sector support. And in the case of Michigan, public sector support for CAVs is also public sector support for our biggest industry here in Michigan. So I think one of the reasons that our Michigan project even came to be was because the leadership and the visionary nature of our local leadership. So I hope that we here in Michigan can prove out this, as you mentioned, Shana, this ambitious project. I think if we can prove this out here in Michigan and give other public agencies the trust that this can work, it will help us be able to deploy this technology in other regions, but also just set the tone for leadership to be able to, public sector leadership to welcome these sorts of opportunities and a little bit more innovative thinking in terms of these big, ambitious, capital intensive projects.
Yeah,
the collaboration is really important.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and picking up on kind of what each of you has said in the context of your own work, the idea of like, how do you effectively design these public-private partnerships to be able to grow the ambition and the kind of appetite for new ideas and bringing new projects to life. So I personally, I hope that other cities and regions are taking note of Michigan's ability to kind of have all these different stakeholders at the table, so that you know, the city and the state can act quickly and in a supportive way, but that you're also not assuming the full risk just on the public side or just on the private side. I think there's really a lot of value creation and kind of incentive alignment that's very healthy that happens when you have both public and private actors at the table. Roshni, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about kind of Michigan Central, as you stated, really core to the vision of the district is that it is this open platform where kind of new ideas can take hold, new concepts can be tested. How do you think about that infrastructure, like how you can kind of set the tone to create this walkable, this vibrant district, but also really put a flag in the ground and welcome ambitious innovators from around the world to come there and test their concepts?
Yeah, I think one core idea is making sure the spaces are open for collaboration. So one of the buildings in our development, the book depository building, is solely focused on collaborative spaces for innovators. So it'll be a mix of co-working space, maker space, labs. We're actually talking to like founders and other innovators in the space to understand what would be helpful for them as we build that space out. And another important aspect will be testing sites. And so right now we're planning to have pilots running in the district, and we want to set entrepreneurs up to be able to develop, launch, test, do all of the aspects of launching a product or service within the district. So it's still being determined exactly what the testing spaces will look like, but we are planning to have testing available. And I think the biggest underlying factor for all of this is making sure our spaces are flexible. So I think we've learned that, you know, entrepreneurs don't always need, you know, a certain type of office space. You need different types of spaces for whatever phase your company is at, and also for what you're doing that day, what stage of the product development you're in. And so we're trying our best to make sure the spaces can be flexible and can kind of grow with our community members as they need it.
Great, love that.
Great. So I'd love to chime in with another question we have here from the audience, and changing gears just a little bit. So someone writes in about how you're all thinking about mobility strategies and kind of advancements evolving as really globally people are starting to think more about and shift their values as they think about circularity and sustainability and the impact that transportation, which we know is a major contributor to climate change impacts. How you think about mobility evolving to address that large problem and to accommodate kind of customer preferences too, as people think about their own footprint and how they move around throughout their day. So maybe Allison, I'd be curious if you kind of want to chime in first with how you think about this question.
Yeah, so when we think about the overall sustainable footprint of our transportation, there's a lot that actually goes into it. If you go all the way back to the mines where the various things that go into your mobility piece come from, walking's really great. And so even looking at community design and how we can truly encourage, even in crappy weather, people to be able to use active transportation. And that's actually, so I'm working on in the policy space now, in part because it always fascinated me that EV advocates were like completely separate from bike advocates. And their bike advocates are somewhat separate from pedestrian and like walkable city advocates, but less so, even though all of these things are deeply intertwined. And so I think as we think about sustainability, really thinking about transportation as a system and a system that has a lot of stuff coming in and that we can design it differently. We designed the roads and the cities that we have today. We brought ourselves to this point and we can get ourselves to a different point. And so I think just thinking differently about modes is really an interesting way to help with that. And more so in Europe than here in the US, there's a lot of interesting activity going on to look at the circularity of the life of a vehicle. So there's lots of recyclability requirements already for vehicle chassis and things like that. So lots of metal. But now we're seeing a lot more activity in terms of the batteries. Oftentimes at the end of life, there's still quite a bit of capacity left in an EV car battery. Are there, second life applications that can be used for grid to allow for better load leveling in terms of bringing renewables on board, which I think is an exciting opportunity. But then also looking at how do we get back down to the raw materials and bring those back into the supply chain in a way that diverts the need to go into other resources and continue mining and doing that in ways that maybe are less suitable for the environment. But I think it's something where it also means that we're going to have to think about mining. And what does that mean? Where are the materials coming from that help to improve our vehicles and our options? Because in a lot of cases, especially for batteries, the materials aren't always processed in a way that I think we would hope that they would be. So more clarity and transparency and just awareness of the general public on that supply chain, I think will help a lot too.
Yeah, that's such a great point. We have in one of our programs at New Lab, the Prospect Mining Studio, we're thinking about natural resource mining and how do you make that more sustainable, and looking at even electrification in the context of mining operations is one way that you start to reduce environmental impact of those operations. But I think that's a really great point. We can't just think about cars once they're on the road and being driven around, but it really is this full life cycle of how something comes to be and what happens when that first owner or driver considers it to be at the end of its life. That's a great point. Sort of sticking on that, and I welcome anyone else to jump into this as well. Allison, from your perspective, as you mentioned, you're kind of steeped in the policy side of things now. If you had a magic wand or a whole lot of resources to dedicate to helping to make transportation cleaner, what would be your first move? Is it a policy move? Is it something on the manufacturing side? Is it education? Like, what do you think is the biggest kind of lever we could pull right now if we had the ability to do so?
Oh, I'd have all the fun. No, that's a really good question, because I don't. So I'm an EV advocate based in Michigan. So it ends up, you end up very balanced in what does it mean to go fully EV, but what does that mean for the people that already exist in the job infrastructure around the current paradigm. And so I don't think, if I could flip a switch and pay for all of the manufacturing turnover to all car plants can do EVs, that'd probably be a really easy way to do it. But that doesn't mean that people know that they should be buying them. Right. So I do think that we need to have better, broader, just public awareness about what are EVs, what are they not. There's a lot more vehicle platforms that are going to be launched in the next 36 months. So just making people aware, there's probably, you like XYZ type of vehicle, there's probably going to be a vehicle available for you. But I think industry is taking that on. And so I actually, if I had all the money, wouldn't dive in there. Mm-hmm. I think actually helping our policymakers and the people that are trying to wrangle this world of the future, working on education for them to understand. We've been able to operate on a single paradigm for over 70 years in terms of internal combustion engine vehicles and how we manage roads, roughly. And that's been a lot of how we think about transportation in the US. Mm-hmm. That is not all of transportation. There's also ships, there's trains, and now we've got AVs, connected vehicles, and all of this new technology actually changes that whole underlying paradigm and can allow us, because before, you couldn't have, citywide data around emissions are tied to commute. Now we can. There's just that ability to have more information that can actually allow us to think about policy instead of every tailpipe needs to be X. We can think about things as a system and potentially drive policy to manage the system towards the outcome that we want, versus telling everybody, you have to get 57 miles to the gallon or have an EV. Mm-hmm. If we can think about how many people did we divert to bikes, how many people were able to walk to school, how many people didn't have to commute because they could telecommute. all of a sudden broadband communication becomes a really important part of our transportation policy.
Right.
But now that we can actually track and understand that data better, I believe we need to shift policy in that direction, to look more at high level outcomes, and then let people figure out what works best for themselves. That fits well with the American ethos. What works best for themselves in terms of meeting those higher level goals. So that's what I'd put my money at.
I love it. I'm ready to sign up. Gary, I want to go back to something you started to hint at earlier on in the conversation, in terms of EV adoption and thinking about from the consumer perspective. There's things like range anxiety, to Allison's point. People may be looking for a certain kind of car, and if there's not an EV option, they don't see themselves in an EV today, but maybe they will soon in the future. How do you think about that, with your GM hat on, in terms of what it's going to take to see EVs scale, particularly in the US context?
Yeah, I think Allison hit the nail on the nose. There definitely has to be a vast education from a consumer standpoint and also from policymakers. Right now it's almost at a point, if it's not broke, why fix it? And so that's what you're seeing. While there's EVs on the market available for purchase, you're still seeing people, go the traditional route of purchasing an ICE engine. So I think there's going to be education, and it's probably going to be some type of mandate where the emissions that are emitted from cars are not allowed. Because I still don't think, even with the education, I'm not sure we'll get the consumer to move over. To be frankly honest, if I wasn't in automotive, I don't know if I know. I mean, I like cars, but I don't know if I would pay that much attention to it. And so if I consider myself like the average consumer, I mean, you hear AV, EV. Sometimes when I'm talking to friends, I use those terms. People still don't know what it is. But it's very, so it's a huge part of my world. So I'm like, how could you not? But that's just, kind of a testament of like the market isn't meeting the demand yet, right? I think we have a lot of, all of the OEMs are merging or marching toward an EV fleet of vehicles offering, but we will have to figure out the piece of how we get consumers to purchase. Infrastructure is another thing. A lot of the automotives are questioning, should they own infrastructure? Should we be, providing charging stations? Well, we don't own gas stations, right? And people, they find a way to fuel their cars. So that's the argument. But however, when you're introducing new technology into the market, you have to provide people with comfort. And there's a lot of people that, like the Tesla owners of the world. Tesla, they put in the infrastructure, right? They bit the bullet. And so I think that kind of creates comfort. And that's why I think you see a higher adoption amongst that brand. And so there are some things that has to be worked out. The other piece of it is, the technology in the cars. As we move to AV, the municipalities will have to adapt some of the sensors in the cities, like in landscapes, and embedded into the traffic signals, embedded into the street lights, embedded into the roads. And so all those things matter. And so collectively, we're all going to have to work together to figure this thing out. It's not a OEM, it's not a municipality, it's not the customer. We'll have to merge together and synchronize our powers to figure out, how do we make this work?
Yeah, absolutely. Wise words. Also, just to put a fine point on it, I think what you're saying is so true. It's like infrastructure is now part of the customer experience. So if we want to change behavior or make people more comfortable in making a different type of decision, then they have to have the confidence that not just their car is going to work as they expect it to, but that as they move through the world, the systems are in place to make that possible. Maggie, anything to add from some of the types of technologies that you're exploring at CAVNU for how the road itself, the infrastructure, can support the vehicles of the future?
Yeah, I think we've covered off well on from an electrification and that infrastructure. I think a few other things come to mind in terms of making sure that the infrastructure is what we like to think of it as future-proofed. I think if you think about a rail station and the capital or a rail line, if you think about the capital required to put that into the ground and use that fixed route on the exactly where the rail was laid decades ago, and those fixed routes. But as Allison talking about, how might we design communities differently to have things closer together, or just the flexibility that infrastructure can provide, and not necessarily a lot of it will be capital. Infrastructure by definition is capital intensive, but we're trying to think through what are some ways where we can bring down some of that upfront cost and make it a little bit more flexible to change. Technology is changing so quickly. We don't necessarily want to be designing a corridor that we expect to look the same for the next 100 years, but rather light, minimal infrastructure that can support what we need now, but also change as the technology evolves, as our needs evolve, as new modes evolve, as human travel patterns evolve. So I think the other piece is trying to think about ways that we can start to, I think infrastructure, we often think massive investment, heavy physical assets, and we're trying to rethink what is the minimal infrastructure required to actually do what we need, and how can infrastructure, also sensors, things, light technology heavy infrastructure can also help us better maintain our roads that are more capital intensive with pouring concrete. So I think some of the thinking through how the infrastructure can be easily upgraded and easily updated to keep in touch with how quickly technology is moving as well, I think is important.
Great. Hui, I know a lot of your work is focused on AV, but when it comes to EV innovations, and we're talking about the idea of electrifying not just personal vehicles, but all types of fleets, where do you see the technical advances? Is it in battery development? Like what kind of advancements are exciting to you, or do you think are going to be that kind of next horizon of innovation to continue to see EVs proliferate?
Right. So so over the last several years, the cost of battery has come down enough that is now becoming really competitive, right? So, and they are much cleaner. And I think we need to start thinking about, electrified vehicles potentially as an energy buffer, not the two-way charger per se, but batteries or electrified vehicles can be demand response, meaning you don't need to have batteries right next to every renewable energy source, but you can stop or slow down charging for these batteries. If we start thinking about the whole thing, the whole system, then there are a lot of potentials for EV to be adopted, especially for shared mobilities. I think so Shanna, you asked a question earlier, what would Allison do first? And I'll say share is very, very important. So if we start changing the view of what vehicles are, they are just elevators for big cities. So inside the core area of big cities, people shouldn't be driving their own vehicles because parking is challenging, congested, and so on and so forth. So if big cities like London or Brooklyn or Manhattan start to say no personal vehicles and only elevators, and these elevators are small delivery robots or autonomous vehicles, but they are all electrified. That's really the future. I think share, electrified, autonomous, and connected, they are all together.
I love that. And yeah, I hear you on that vision for how do we keep personally owned vehicles outside of city centers and create space for different options to take hold. Kate, do you want to close us out with one last question from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got one that I think is a little fun here for folks. So as I think some of you may have seen in the news, Pete Buttigieg was tapped to be the next transportation secretary in the incoming administration next year. So kind of another magic wand question here. Let's say that you have the opportunity to speak with him and basically say from the federal perspective, this is what I would love to see happen. This should be your first step, or this is my kind of like key piece of advice as you think about your role. Would love to invite anyone to kind of just share your thoughts with us on what that conversation might look like should you have that opportunity. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I think a rethink of transit, so FTA, or public transit system, and maybe gasoline tax.
Nice. Let's go around. Everyone's got to say something to close this out. Doesn't have to be well thought out. I know we're putting you on the spot. Allison, I see you unmuted.
Again, just pushing towards that idea of system level thinking. And I think that he has already demonstrated some of that through the proposals that he had put out when he was working on his presidential bid. So with the policy work I'm doing, I'm very excited to dig in with him and the work they'll be doing.
Nice. Maggie?
Yeah, maybe just to add on that, I think maybe tying together what Allison and Hui said, I think one interesting thing we found is in thinking about what sort of federal legislation is required. We are going to the FHWA and the FTA for one ask, but I've been amazed how separately those agencies think. So a systems level thinking even within their own agency, I think would be valuable.
Nice. Roshni?
I think a push towards kind of to what Hui was saying, incorporating more new forms of shared mobility into public transit systems in order to make, to push adoption towards public transit versus car ownership in cities. And in addition to that, potentially like improving or standardizing the RFP process when working with cities in order to make that easier. Because as someone who worked for a mobility startup and has submitted RFPs with cities, they take a significant amount of time. You need a specific person on your team dedicated for every city. So it's very difficult for a lot of these startup companies to work with cities today. So I think if we can improve that relationship, it would make it a lot easier to push that forward.
Great. Love that. Rogeria?
I think I would say probably partnering with automotive and trying to communicate education of EV and AV, what it is and the benefits of it. I think also maybe pushing some of the automotive or the EV makers on what do they do with those second and third use of the battery. So once that car is returned, what do we do with it? And I think we can, Allison touch upon it, but using those batteries for the grid. So other green initiatives. So I think just, kind of moving the needle on how we have traditionally thought about things and mobility and making amends of like the new way of doing it and how it's better for our future.
Great. I love it. I hope Mayor Pete is tuning in right now. We'll have to get him a memo of these ideas as he moves into the role. Well, thank you again so much for each of you taking time out of your busy schedules. Kate's going to close us out with a couple of housekeeping notes, but just want to say thank you again. We've really appreciated this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shana. Thanks for everybody for tuning in this afternoon for our webinar for this discussion. A big thank you to all of our panelists for your time and sharing your insights. This was such an excellent conversation. And just for everyone on the line, we'll have a post-event follow-up from New Lab where we'll send you a recording of this event so you can share it around to anyone that you think might be interested. So just a big thank you again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.